Starmer's so-called Labour government is better described as a burning skip, and its disintegration would be, frankly, very funny if it wasn't for those who would suffer the consequences, and if it wasn't happening at a time when the far right are on the march everywhere. So, what's the latest in this catalogue of calamity? In the latest addition to the astronomically high pile of these people really don't have the faintest clue what they're doing, and they don't actually really believe in anything, Rachel Reeves, our flailing chancellor, watered down plans to tax non-doms. Non-doms being very rich people who live here, but for tax purposes are conveniently registered abroad. Now, Labour's plans here were amongst the only plans they had to get the well-off in this country to actually cough up a little bit more dosh. Pretty reasonable, given the country's falling apart. Why has Reeves watered down these plans? Well, because of intense lobbying by these very rich and thus very powerful non-doms. She told the World Economic Forum in Davos, and this really did make me laugh, "We have been listening to the concerns that have been raised by the non-dom community." I'm sorry, but that is funny. I've heard it all now. We've got the black community. We've got the LGBTQ community. We've got the Jewish community. We've got the Muslim community. And now we've got the non-dom community. Who knew that extremely rich people living here and not paying taxes are in fact another treasured minority in our diverse multicultural society? Now, here's the thing. There's no question these non-doms have big, sharp elbows. They've got money and therefore they've got power. Not the same with pensioners, by the looks of things, is it? The winter fuel payment was scrapped for the large majority of pensioners, and despite the claims of the government, that included many struggling and indeed poor pensioners, notably those eligible for pension credit who don't receive it. There was no shortage of outrage over that, but the government just ignored it. Therein lies a lesson about our so-called democracy, about who gets listened to and who doesn't. Rich non-doms, you've got the government's ear. An 82-year-old pensioner in Newcastle who's scared to turn the heating on during freezing weather because she doesn't know if she can afford it. Bad luck. Maybe next time you should hire some expensive lobbyists so Rachel Reeves will listen to you. Now, what else? When Keir Starmer was running to be leader of the Labour Party, the courts ruled that a third runway at Heathrow Airport was illegal because the government didn't act adequately to take into account its commitments to tackle the climate emergency, that minor little issue which threatens the future survival of our species. And at the time, Starmer tweeted, "Congratulations to the climate campaigners. There is no more important challenge than the climate emergency. That is why I voted against Heathrow expansion." Such principle, such leadership. So what's happened now? He's Prime Minister. Well, here's the thing. His Chancellor has made clear that Heathrow expansion is likely because when she was asked about it, she replied, "Growth is the number one mission of this government." Well, Rachel, there is no growth on a dead planet. And also, ever more extreme weather events and rampaging fires are not, I'm afraid, very good for growth either. This is California this month. Does this look good for growth? Let's listen to what the brilliant journalist George Monbiot has to say about the Heathrow decision.
It's just what we don't need. We're in the midst of a climate emergency. We already have huge levels of local pollution around Heathrow and Gatwick and Luton, terrible noise pollution as well. It really seriously affects people's quality of life. And there's a very simple way of dealing with this, which is demand management. About 70% of the flights in this country are taken by just 15% of the population, the richest 15%. Many of them going backwards and forwards to their second homes and multiple holidays every year. We should be taxing those frequent flyers. There should be a frequent flyer levy which discourages that demand and brings it back down so that we don't need to keep on building more runways and expanding airports and making the whole environmental problem worse.
And meanwhile, Starmer repeatedly declared there would be no return to austerity. The austerity pursued under the Tories was, of course, a catastrophe for this country. It produced the longest squeeze in wages ever recorded since the beginning of the 19th century. It shredded public services and left our infrastructure quite literally falling apart. Well, now Rachel Reeves is mulling steeper cuts to already disintegrating public services. Now, as the former chief economist for the Bank of England put it, that risks an economic doom loop.
If that led to a cutting back on investment and indeed in spending more generally, then I think you really are into a doom loop between debt and growth. And that's a situation to avoid at all costs.
And the speculation is that she is going to cut spending. So there is a risk of this doom loop, as you call it.
Yeah.
Now, let's just be very clear about how we ended up in this situation. Before the election, the Labour leadership thought they were terribly clever by ruling out a series of tax hikes on the well-to-do. But it's still clear to me they were avoiding discussing a projected £20 billion black hole in the nation's finances. During the election, the media refused to talk about it. I went on TV and I spoke about it over and over and over again, saying that Labour would pretend to discover it when they were elected and then justify cuts.
For me, it's about the looming black hole in the nation's finances, which neither political party is being honest about.
How the hell have we got through weeks of a general election campaign without the main focus on domestic policy about a £20 billion a year black hole and how we fill it? Guess what? That's what went on to happen. Starmer and Reeves did speech after speech talking about economic doom and gloom to justify the cuts they plan to make. The consequence, they sucked consumer and business confidence out of the economy. And then because they backed themselves into a corner, they went on to hike the worst possible tax, national insurance employers' contributions, which impacts both wages and hiring. A completely ludicrous position, not least because they kept saying their whole strategy was about growth. Their whole strategy actually succeeded in undermining growth and economic confidence. And now they threaten Britain with an economic doom loop. At the same time, they've kicked Labour MPs out of the party because they have the temerity to vote against Tory benefit cuts, which drive children into poverty and squalor. They're now beginning a new clampdown on benefit claimants, even though benefit fraud is a tiny fraction of the social security budget. And there's a far, far bigger problem of benefits people are entitled to, but they're not claiming each year. An estimated £23 billion a year, in fact, kicking the poor while standing up for the rich. What is the point of this Labour government? What is the point of a Labour party that behaves like this? I mean, Starmer and co underlined whose side they're on when they accepted endless freebies from wealthy individuals and organisations, even though their salaries are much higher than the average Brit can dream of. And it's supposed to be a service. It's not a career. It's supposed to be a public service, not a means of milking it as a cash cow. Look, this whole political project is just based on deceit, kowtowing to the rich, and having no vision for country in crisis. Starmer became leader in the first place because he committed to policies like taxing the rich to invest, public ownership, scrapping tuition fees, and indeed putting human rights at the heart of foreign policy, which was rather undermined by arming a genocide in Gaza, a soulless, empty project only handed power because the Tories, metaphorically speaking, doused themselves in petrol and then just set themselves on fire. And even then, Labour only won 33.7% of the vote, with the lowest turnout of eligible adults in the history of our democracy. Now, in some polling, Labour's in third place, while Farage's reform are surging. And the polling on why Labour has been abandoned by so many voters since the election is instructive. At the top, in terms of reasons given by voters, is the winter fuel allowance cuts, followed by not reducing the cost of living. We've gone through the worst squeeze in living standards since the Victorian age, broken promises and not standing up to the rich, while the genocide in Gaza also features. Now, Labour are sinking, but the radical right are surging everywhere, including in Britain. And this catastrophe is paving the way for a Farage government, unless those of us who want an actual alternative get our act together and make an argument to build a society where wealth and power is in the hands of the many, not the few. That's what we've got to fight for. We've got a long road ahead.